Picture this: a $2 billion American warship loaded with enough precision firepower to systematically dismantle a mid-sized city was just ordered to turn around by an Iranian radio operator. The ultimatum: alter your course or cease to exist in exactly 30 minutes. And the United States Navy destroyer, it turned around. This is not an internet rumor. It is not a piece of highly produced propaganda out of Tehran. This happened, and Washington is desperately praying that you just scroll past it, that you treat it as just another chaotic headline in a noisy world. But having spent years inside the highest levels of the United States military intelligence apparatus, I can tell you this with absolute chilling certainty. What just occurred in the Strait of Hormuz is not a minor tactical footnote. It is a strategic earthquake. Let us talk about the ship in question. The USS Milius, DDG-69, is an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. Now, I do not want you to think about that in the sanitized, sterile language of a Pentagon press release. I want you to understand the terrifying physical reality of what this vessel represents. This is a floating fortress that costs roughly $2 billion to build and over $80,000 a day just to operate. It carries 96 vertical launch cells. We are talking about Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-2, SM-6 interceptors, and anti-submarine weapons, each costing upward of $2 million apiece. It operates the Aegis combat system, undeniably the most sophisticated naval battle management network humanity has ever put to sea, capable of tracking and engaging hundreds of airborne targets in the blink of an eye. Add to that a 5-inch main gun with a 17-mile reach and twin phalanx close-in weapon systems that vomit 3,000 rounds per minute to shred incoming threats. In any conventional threat matrix, on any piece of analytical paper in Washington, this ship does not yield to anyone. Think back to the height of the Cold War. In 1988, during the Black Sea bumping incident, the U.S. Yorktown was literally rammed by a Soviet frigate, and it did not alter its course by a single degree. That very same year, during Operation Praying Mantis, the U.S. Navy sank half of the operational fleet of Iran in a single afternoon. Historically, turning around simply did not exist in the American naval lexicon. And yet today, DDG-69 turned around. Why? Because the commanding officer on that bridge, a professional surrounded by billions of dollars of cutting-edge technology, realized a terrifying truth. In the confined, treacherous waters of the Strait of Hormuz, an Aegis destroyer functions, not as the apex predator of the oceans, but as a heavily armored bank vault sitting paralyzed on train tracks, watching the headlights of an oncoming locomotive. Paper capability and operational reality in that specific stretch of water are two entirely different universes. In the brutal arithmetic of global power, empires do not always fall with a fiery explosion. Sometimes they just quietly turn around and sail away. The mainstream media will not tell you what I am about to explain, because telling you would require them to admit 30 years of catastrophic American strategic failure in a single broadcast. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps did not just hail the Milius randomly. They did not shout a desperate warning into the radio and hope for the best. They identified that ship by its specific hull number, DDG-69. Understand what that implies. It means they had been quietly tracking it, watching its approach vector, calculating its speed, heading, and precise GPS position, and feeding that data in real time into a coastal targeting network that has been painstakingly built over 3 decades. When that transmission went out on an open frequency, it was not a bluff. It was a cold, calculated technical statement. It was an Iranian targeting officer telling an American commander, "We have already computed the flight time from our launch positions to your current coordinates, and it is exactly 30 minutes. That is not a threat. That is a countdown." And the difference between a threat and a countdown is everything in naval warfare. In my time as a military intelligence officer and weapons inspector, I developed a very particular respect for adversaries who actually do their homework. And Iran has studied American naval doctrine with the ruthless patience of a chess grandmaster who has been memorizing your opening moves for 30 years. What backed up that radio transmission was not bravado. It was pure, hardened infrastructure, Look at the map. Cut deep into the Zagros mountain range, stretching along the northern shoreline of the Strait of Hormuz, are massive subterranean tunnel networks. These are not simple caves. They are hardened, distributed launch facilities shielded by hundreds of meters of solid granite. And here is the geographical reality you need to grasp. The Strait of Hormuz is incredibly claustrophobic. At its narrowest point, it is barely 21 nautical miles wide, with commercial shipping lanes restricted to just 2 miles in either direction. Inside those unassailable mountain tunnels wait mobile missile launchers. They house the Nor anti-ship missile, flying a sea-skimming profile at wave-top height to defeat radar packing a warhead large enough to permanently retire a destroyer. They have the Qadr, extending that lethal reach to 200 kilometers, and they have the Nasser, a smaller, incredibly fast missile designed specifically for saturation attacks. You fire 20 of them simultaneously. You overwhelm the Aegis point defense system of the ship through sheer brute force volume. You do not need every missile to get through. You just need enough. But the true nightmare, the weapon that alters the entire calculus of modern naval warfare in confined waters, is the Khalij Fars. It is a ballistic anti-ship missile. It flies a parabolic trajectory, arcing high above the atmosphere before coming down directly on a moving target at Mach 3 in a near-vertical terminal dive. Think about the terrifying physics of intercepting that. The Phalanx close-in weapon system on the Milius might fire 3,000 rounds a minute, but against a Mach 3 vertical threat in a geographic choke point, your detection comes fatally late. Your response time is measured in seconds, not minutes. Even if the Phalanx miraculously shreds the incoming missile at the absolute last second, the sheer kinetic energy and burning shrapnel traveling at supersonic speeds will still rain down and tear the ship apart. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer a navigable waterway for hostile forces. It is an asymmetrical killbox, a geopolitical spiderweb woven from solid rock, radar waves, and hypersonic physics. The commanding officer of the U.S. Milius knew this mathematical certainty. That is why he called CENTCOM. That is why the order came back to come about. And that is exactly why the Milius turned around. In the modern era of asymmetric warfare, the ultimate weapon is not the missile that sinks the ship. It is the calculated geography that makes firing the missile entirely unnecessary. Now, let me take you inside the operational logic of the IRGC, because this is where the reality gets deeply uncomfortable for anyone who has spent time studying asymmetric warfare doctrine. Do you remember 2016? 10 American sailors, intercepted off Farsi Island, forced to their knees with their hands clasped behind their heads. Do you remember the 2019 swarming incidents or the 2020 close approaches where Iranian speedboats came within 10 meters of American warships? Each one of those incidents was managed, contained, and treated by Washington as a minor provocation that fell below the threshold of a kinetic response. But here is what Washington missed, and what I saw clearly from the moment those incidents began accumulating. The IRGC was not acting randomly. They were building a database. They were conducting a 30-year empirical study on the exact location of the American Red Line. Like a structural engineer relentlessly applying pressure to a load-bearing wall, they were running methodical stress tests on the architecture of American deterrence, searching for the precise microscopic fracture where the concrete begins to fail. What happened with the U.S. Milius was not just another test. It was the ultimate application of everything they had learned. Sunday Tizu understood 2,500 years ago that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. What Iran executed against the Milius was not primarily a military operation. It was a psychological decapitation strike executed with terrifying precision. The psychological shockwave from that single radio transmission is still ripping through the United States Navy right now, in ways that will never appear in any Pentagon press briefing. Picture a young sailor on an American destroyer in the Persian Gulf today. You have been told your entire career, in every classroom and every deployment simulation, that the United States Navy unconditionally owns these waters. You are taught that the mere silhouette of a billion-dollar American warship is an absolute deterrent. And then, you stand on that steel deck, and you watch your commanding officer, a seasoned professional, receive a radio transmission and turn the ship around. You watch the Iranian coastline recede behind you, and in that singular, devastating moment, you realize that the waters you are navigating are not yours. You realize that somewhere in those mountains, a targeting computer already has the coordinates of your ship locked. You realize that deterrence runs in both directions. The history of conflict, from the jungles of Vietnam to the collapse of the Soviet military machine, teaches us one undeniable truth. Armies do not disintegrate when they run out of ammunition. They collapse when they stop believing in their own invincibility. That hesitation, that recalculated caution, is exactly what Iran was purchasing with that radio call. They planted a terminal seed of doubt into the institutional psychology of the entire American military posture. Here is the brutal arithmetic of strategic signaling. A sunken destroyer gives America a martyr, a rallying cry, and a legally defensible mandate for a devastating military retaliation. But a destroyer that turns around, it gives Iran a narrative, and in the 21st century, narratives destroy empires much faster than torpedoes ever could. But stay with me, because what I have not yet told you is what the actual options for America are, and why every single one of them carries a cost that Washington is absolutely terrified to discuss honestly with the American public. The reality is that the Pentagon is currently staring down a fatal trilemma, 3 doors, and behind every single one of them is a different kind of catastrophe. Option 1 is what the hawks in every secure conference room, from the Pentagon to the National Security Council, are screaming for right now. Kinetic escalation. Strike the coastal missile batteries. Send in the B-2 stealth bombers and Tomahawk cruise missiles to systematically dismantle the tunnel networks in the Zagros Mountains. Reassert the narrative of American naval dominance through overwhelming force. Having served in military intelligence, I understand why that argument is seductive in a crisis moment. It feels like action, but here is the brutal operational reality that the advocates of that option are hiding from you. You cannot eliminate the coastal defense capability of Iran. You can degrade it, sure, but those tunnels are cut into solid rock distributed across hundreds of miles of coastline. The moment American aircraft begin striking Iranian installations, the IRGC activates everything simultaneously. Every surviving missile battery, every fast attack swarm, every proxy force from Yemen to Lebanon. It becomes a full-scale regional war. And here is the financial data point the administration prays you do not calculate. The Strait of Hormuz facilitates roughly 20% of the total oil consumption of the world. If a kinetic conflict closes that waterway, we are not just talking about a supply chain disruption. We are talking about crude oil instantly spiking past $150 a barrel. It would trigger an inflationary shockwave that would make the 1973 oil crisis look like a minor market correction, completely obliterating the Western inflation control system overnight. Option 2 is diplomatic de-escalation, using back channels through Oman, Switzerland, or Qatar to quietly signal that America is open to a more limited framework for managing access to the strait. In purely strategic terms, and in terms of avoiding the catastrophic regional war one just described, it is the least bad option available. But here is what the mainstream media will not tell you. Using a diplomatic back channel to soften your position immediately after an American destroyer fled from an Iranian radio call does not look like de-escalation. It looks exactly like capitulation, beautifully wrapped in diplomatic packaging. And Iran knows it. The third option, the one being whispered in the most restricted conversations in Washington, is the ultimate gamble: send the carrier. Send the U.S. Abraham Lincoln itself directly into the northern approaches of the strait. You want to threaten a destroyer. Fine. Here is a nuclear-powered Leviathan. Here are 80 strike aircraft on its deck, 2 guided missile cruisers on its flanks, and an attack submarine hunting silently beneath it that you cannot see and cannot locate. Make the call. But let me be entirely clear. Deploying a carrier strike group into a 21-mile wide geographical choke point against a fully mature anti-access and area denial network is not a freedom of navigation exercise. It is a massive, unhedged bet with the core symbol of American global power. Washington is no longer playing a grand game of geopolitical chess. They are trapped in a burning house where every single exit is rigged with explosives. If you force a superpower to choose between a devastating regional war, a humiliating diplomatic retreat, or a catastrophic strategic gamble, you have already defeated them before the first shot is even fired. Stay with me, because what I am about to tell you is something that the coverage of this crisis by the mainstream media has almost entirely missed. And it is arguably the most consequential dimension of everything that has happened over the past 72 hours. This crisis is not about Iran, not fundamentally. Iran is the immediate actor, the Strait of Hormuz is the immediate geography, and the nuclear negotiation is the immediate political context. But the audience for what happened to the USS Milius is not in Tehran. The audience that matters most, the audience whose strategic calculations will determine the shape of the global order for the next 30 years, is sitting in Beijing. I have said this for years in closed-door intelligence briefings that made certain people in Washington deeply uncomfortable, and I will say it again, now with the full weight of what just happened as evidence. The entire strategic planning horizon for China in the Indo-Pacific is built around a single empirical question: is American power projection in that region as absolute and unchallengeable as it appears? Or is it like the USS Milius, something that can be made to turn around? What the mainstream media will not tell you is that the PLA has been studying Iranian anti-access and area denial doctrine with intense professional interest for well over a decade. The DF-21D and the DF-26, the infamous carrier-killer ballistic missiles of China, were not developed in a vacuum. The PLA watched every IRGC speedboat swarm. They analyzed every close approach. They modeled the physics of Iranian missile tests against simulated carrier targets. And they have been asking the exact same question the IRGC has been asking, but on a much larger scale and with a much more consequential geographic objective in mind. At what point does the tactical logic of asset preservation override the strategic imperative of mission execution? The USS Milius just gave them a refined, definitive answer to that question. And that answer just accelerated the timeline for every war game being run in Beijing regarding Taiwan and the South China Sea. But here is the data point that should genuinely terrify every defense planner in Washington. When America realizes its deterrence is failing, its default reflex is to outbuild the adversary, but that era is over. Today, naval shipyards in China possess a shipbuilding capacity that is roughly 232 times greater than that of the United States. Let that catastrophic metric sink in. While America struggles with backlogged repair yards and an aging fleet, Beijing is launching the tonnage equivalent of the entire French Navy every single year. If an Aegis destroyer can be forced to retreat by an adversary with a fraction of the defense budget of America, what happens when that exact same asymmetric doctrine is applied by a peer competitor with an industrial base that eclipses ours by orders of magnitude? The Strait of Hormuz was merely the laboratory. The Western Pacific will be the factory floor. The geopolitical earthquake just happened in the Middle East, but the tsunami is about to make landfall in the South China Sea. And when it does, turning around will no longer be an option. The global order established in 1945, underpinned by absolute American military supremacy, is silently collapsing in a narrow strait. The twilight of an empire rarely arrives with a deafening roar. It begins with a destroyer that dares not advance and a forced retreat. The wheel of history has turned and the world is watching. How much longer do you think the strategic credit of America can be overdrawn? Tell me your answer in the comments.